So I'm now over on my computer here, and before we get started looking at those, I have one sin that I need to confess, and that is I edit my film photos. Okay, right? I mean, who doesn't? And frankly, it'd be stupid not to. I mean, do you edit your raw photos? Yes, of course you do. And if you don't edit them, they're gonna look dumb. So let's just name that they are edited. And the way that I edit my photos, especially when I'm doing medium format photos, there's kind of 3 steps in them. So as I compare these 2 films in here, I'm going to kind of show all 3 of those steps here, and hopefully that can help you find any differences or traits that you might want to pull out. Now also, I'm going to totally be honest that like some of the differences might be due to like my perception of what these films should look like and how they should be different, and that I might be editing to accentuate those perceived differences rather than the reality, because I don't care what gold is supposed to look like. I don't care what portrait is supposed to look like. I care that my photos match the vision that I had for them. And so some of the differences might come from that work in the way that my brain is processing them, as well as the way that the computer is processing them, as well as the way that the film is processing itself. Real quick, we're gonna slide on in here and let's look at these photos. So they actually got scanned backwards. So the second roll down here is the ones with Portra. These ones up on the top here, these are the ones with gold. And I just am gonna go through and we're gonna look at a couple photos that this is directly as they were converted when they were put into Negative Lab Pro. So I took a picture of them using my camera and my Veloy setup, and I just, doing no settings whatsoever, just converted them to a positive. So we're gonna look at these first couple photos here on Portra. Let's look at that one, and this one of me and Nico. And then I'm gonna compare that to this one, this one, this one, this contrasty one, and this one here. And I'm gonna slide on here, and we got great. So across the top, those are all gold photos. The bottom are portrait photos. Real quick looking at them, it does look like there's maybe a touch more warmth in these photos on gold than there is on these ones with portrait, especially this daytime stuff really had a lot of blues in the shadows. This exposed here, whereas I'm exposing for the shadows, it feels like that's a little bit more balanced. But again, that might be more of like the camera and the system processing rather than the film itself. It also looks like maybe the portrait has a little bit more red tones here in the shadows, but that's kind of it. Those are the big differences I see right off the bat. I'm gonna do let's close these down. I just wanna look at these 2 here. So these 2 photos are probably the most direct comparison of the 2 films, right as they were first in that initial conversion. The one on the left was done with gold, the one on the right is done with Portra. And again, I don't know for sure if this difference that I'm looking at here is due to the film itself or due to the way that it's shot. So from there, let's go through here, and I'm gonna add in the version where I, using Negative Lab Pro, which is my conversion software, was then able to kind of try to balance the photo out. And you can see how much change happened between those 2 photos from its initial conversion into kind of a medium finished form. With that, now we know what those originals look like, and I'm gonna get rid of them just because they're harder to tell the difference. Now I'm looking at these 2 photos, and the difference is really hard to tell, right? If I gave that to myself as a blind taste test and said, which one's gold, which one's portrait, gosh, that would be very, very hard to know. I do know, obviously, the one on the right is the one with portrait, the one on the left is the one with gold. I know that only because I'm the one that did that. Now that I know that, maybe I can see there's a touch more warmth in like the highlights over here of the gold, kind of that yellowy color, and then also maybe a touch more teals in the shadows of portrait. I don't even know if that also might just be my editing in there. It also feels like the gold definitely maybe has a little bit more grain than the portrait does. Yeah, so this is the gold and this is the portrait. So there definitely is more grain on the gold photos than the portrait, but not a ton, especially on 120. It's pretty hard to tell the difference. So then let's also add back in. So this will be the version that I kind of like finalize the edit on. And you can see how then it would convert from there to a more finalized version. So I'm going to take away the intermediary here. And this is where you can really start to see that like gold characteristic come through. But again, I don't know for sure as I'm looking at this photo if that is the film or if that is me editing to match gold. Now, my systems, I don't vary that much between the films. Like the way that I run these through my processor, it's not like I'm going to do a ton of work, but there is a subconscious knowledge as I'm working with this film of this was with gold, so gold's supposed to have a lot more warmth and a lot more brightness and stuff in it. And this is Portra, so it's going to have kind of, especially when overexposed, it should have a little bit more of that, you know, Lightning wedding vibe and stuff. You can definitely see some more red in the shadow tones over here of the Portra than you do with the gold. And you can see a lot more of that yellow tone here on the gold side. All right, let's look at some other photos here. So let's do a comparison of a more contrasty scene. So I'm going to do all three photos here of me, Lena, and Nico, and also of this one here with the ranger station at Paradise. So on the top, that's with gold. On the bottom, that is with Portra. And you can see here, starting on the very right side, those are the straight edits, straight out of camera that were done. Both across the board, there is a lot of both shadow detail and highlight detail, which is very impressive to see how it's rendering. Let's look here nice and close. So I look in here. It definitely, as right now, it looks like it's kind of blowing on my face. Like the highlights are getting clipped. No, they're not getting clipped. They're just like really bright, but it is maintaining. But also you can see the stuff that's in full shadow behind me. Like that's very dark. It's a high contrast scene. You can see my shoulder on here as I'm holding Nico. You can see the high side of my black hat, which is pretty impressive for such a contrasty scene. Now let's go over and we can compare that. Same deal, I'm gonna zoom all the way in and into the deepest of shadows. And maybe in the very deepest of that shadow, you can't quite see the branch on that tree. Or the very inside of this trunk, deep in the shadow, you're starting to lose it. But also if you look up here in the highlights, like you definitely can, it says guide services. You can read that on the middle of the building. You can see all those details on there, which is very impressive. Now, this was a sunset light photo. The other one was prime day. So it is understandable that the Portra would have a little bit easier time just because probably the contrast is a little bit less, but both are really maintaining well across the entire scene. And now let's look through it. This is kind of the medium in, so now I'm going to slide back into this one where we can see them all. And I'm going to take away the two photos here from their initial edits. I'm actually going to take away the more finalized edit. We can look here at just the Negative Lab Pro edit here. And again, you can start to see if the more kind of iconic things according to those films are coming through. I'm pretty sure these both, I'm definitely editing these, looking at them, knowing they are what they are. You can see that I'm putting more kind of pinky rosy colors and more greeny tealy colors into the shadows here. And this one, I know I'm kind of intentionally lifting those shadows a little bit to give it kind of that vintage filmy look and stuff, which you see a lot of people do on gold just because gold being cheaper, a lot of people are just kind of editing because they want it to look filmy. So again, I don't think gold actually does that. That's just kind of more my editing style. But with that, you know, we've even picked up more details. Like you can see my face better. You can see Lena's hair really well and all that kind of stuff. And even those grain structures on that tree are coming through even nicer. And again, now it's even easier to read guide services. And, you know, I think I've edited it down so it looks a little bit darker, but that's kind of more a stylistic choice. Now let's compare those to the final edits of these two films. And this, like, I definitely leaned way hard into like the gold look, but there's still so much detail in these kind of things. I pulled this all back so you can see a lot more on both sides. So I'm gonna look in here, we go full in, easy to read the top. All that kind of stuff got retained. You can see all the details on that one window that's open, all those kind of things that, because the film was shot and edited from a pretty flat perspective, it's then pretty easy to pull it in. But even with that darkness, I'm still retaining a lot of detail in these shadow trees over here and not losing that much, but just making them a lot darker. Then you can compare that over here on that photo with gold, and still, even though it's edited to have a high contrast, you can see the top of Lena's head. You can see my knuckle, see a little bit of either chromatic aberration, probably chromatic aberration on there, maybe a little bit of, yeah, there's some more over there. Wonder if that's from the lens or if that's from the macro lens, but still seeing in the shadows, really pretty impressive. Now let's go over and we're gonna do one more comparison of photos. So let's do a daytime kind of highlight set. So I'm gonna do these three and these three here. Same deal as before. Far left is immediate conversion, then with Negative Lab Pro conversion, and finally the finalized conversion. So you can see how those two things compare. The top being gold, the bottom being Portra. Honestly, those differences are very, very minor. Let's make these and compare that. We'll look at just these two real fast. Definitely more of that red tone here in the shadows of the gold. It's here, you can see some red tones over there, but also some really nice bright blues. That definitely was exposed pretty bright, so that's how it feels. This one over here, the shadow tones feel pretty true. It's a pretty uncontrasty scene right now, because there definitely was some haze also on the day, so it made it that. So now I'm gonna add back in with the Negative Lab Pro edit in here, and man, I would be hard pressed to know which film is which at this point. Like, maybe a little bit crunchier, but that's about it. Let's zoom in, and this is the Portra. Pretty minimal grain, like really pretty hard to see. Maybe we can go look up in the sky, and you can definitely see some grain structure up there. It's a very complex scene, so it's hard to tell what's green and what's trees. And then we'll compare that. But honestly, just looking at the gold, sky looks about the same. I mean, that's a hazier sky. I think this was a more blue day, but like the grain structure between the two of them is pretty minor differences. Maybe the gold is a little bit more saturated. Maybe. It definitely is more saturated in those blue tones, but even if we look up there, like that's probably not that different. And then we can compare that to the full edited versions. And so, yeah. So where do I finish looking at all this? I've looked through and compared these two films and stuff. Honestly, it makes me pretty trepidatious to buy more Portra 160, especially if it's $20 more per 5-pack than it is to buy gold. Like, I get a third of a stop more light, and it's about the same kind of a film. Like, yeah, it's pretty hard to convince me to keep using Portra 160 at this point, just because of that price difference. I still love it, and I still think they look good. And again, there's so much personal preference in here and so much personal editing in these that like this has to be taken as a very subjective viewpoint and very subjective opinions on these about the way that I take photos and the way that I edit my photos. So now that you've seen those, do you agree with me? Have you had similar experiences? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you around. Could you tell me what is true?